Mahayana Buddhism. Because the teaching of the Buddha was a way of liberation, it had no other object than the experience of nirvana. The Buddha did not attempt to set forth a consistent philosophical system, trying to satisfy that intellectual curiosity about ultimate things which expects answers in words. When pressed for such answers, when questioned about the nature of nirvana, the origin of the world, and the reality of the self, the Buddha maintained a noble silence, and went on to say that such questions were irrelevant and did not lead to the actual experience of liberation. It has often been said that the later development of Buddhism was due to the inability of the Indian mind to rest content with that silence, so that at last it had to indulge its overwhelming urge for abstract metaphysical speculations about the nature of reality. Such a view of the genesis of Mahayana Buddhism is, however, rather misleading. The vast body of Mahayana doctrine arose not so much to satisfy intellectual curiosity as to deal with the practical psychological problems encountered in following the Buddha's way. Certainly, the treatment of these problems is highly scholastic, and the intellectual level of the Mahayana texts is very lofty. But the consistent aim is to bring about the experience of liberation, not to construct a philosophical system. In the words of Sir Arthur Berriedale Keith, "The metaphysics of the Mahayana in the incoherence of its systems shows clearly enough the secondary interest attaching to it in the eyes of the monks, whose main interest was concentrated on the attainment of release. The Mahayana, no less than the Hinayana, is concerned vitally with this practical end, and its philosophy is of value merely insofar as it helps men to attain their aim." There are no doubt respects in which Mahayana Buddhism is a concession, both to intellectual curiosity and to a popular desire for shortcuts to the goal. But at root, it is the work of highly sensitive and perceptive minds, studying their own inner workings. To anyone who is highly self-aware, the Buddhism of the Pali Canon leaves many practical problems unanswered. Its psychological insight goes little further than the construction of analytical catalogues of mental functions, and though its precepts are clear, it is not always helpful in explaining their practical difficulties. Perhaps it is too sweeping a generalization, but one receives the impression that whereas the Pali Canon would unlock the door to nirvana by sheer effort, the Mahayana would jiggle the key until it turns smoothly. Thus, the great concern of the Mahayana is the provision of skillful means, upaya, for making nirvana accessible to every type of mentality. How and when the Mahayana doctrines arose is a matter of historical guesswork. The great Mahayana Sutras are ostensibly the teaching of the Buddha and his immediate disciples, but their style is so different and their doctrine so much more subtle than that of the Pali Canon that scholars almost unanimously assign them to later dates. There is no evidence of their existence in the time of the great Buddhist emperor Asoka, grandson of Chandragupta Maurya, who was converted to Buddhism in 262 BC. Asoka's rock inscriptions reflect no more than the social teachings of the Pali Canon, its insistence on ahimsa, or nonviolence to both men and animals, and its general precepts for the life of the laity. The principal Mahayana texts were being translated into Chinese by Kumarajiva shortly after AD 400. But our knowledge of Indian history during the intervening 600 years from Asoka's death is so fragmentary, and the internal evidences of the sutras themselves so vague, that we can do little more than assign them to the 400 years between 100 BC and AD 300. Even specific individuals associated with their development, Asvaghosha, Nagarjuna, Asanga, and Vasubandhu, can be dated only very approximately. The traditional Mahayanist account of its own origin is that its teachings were delivered by the Buddha to his intimate disciples, but their public revelation withheld until the world was ready for them. The principle of delayed revelation is a well-known expedient for permitting the growth of a tradition, for exploring the implications contained in the original seed. Apparent contradictions between earlier and later doctrines are explained by assigning them to different levels of truth, ranging from the most relative to the most absolute, and of which the probably quite late Avatamsaka school distinguishes no less than 5. However, the problem of the historical origins of the Mahayana is of no very direct importance for an understanding of Zen, which, as a Chinese rather than Indian form of Buddhism, came into being when Indian Mahayana was fully grown. We can pass on, therefore, to the central Mahayana doctrines from which Zen arose. The Mahayana distinguishes itself from the Buddhism of the Pali Canon by terming the latter the little, hina, vehicle, yana, of liberation, and itself the great Maha vehicle, great because it comprises such a wealth of upaya, or methods for the realization of nirvana. These methods range from the sophisticated dialect of Nagarjuna, whose object is to free the mind of all fixed conceptions, to the Sukhavati, or Pure Land doctrine of liberation through faith in the power of Amitabha, the Buddha of boundless light, who is said to have attained his awakening many eons before the time of Gautama. They include even the Tantric Buddhism of medieval India, wherein liberation may be realized through the repetition of sacred words and formulae called dharani, and through special types of yoga involving sexual intercourse with a Shakti, or spiritual wife. A preliminary study of the Pali Canon will certainly give the impression that nirvana is to be realized only through rigorous effort and self-control, and that the aspirant should lay aside all other concerns for the pursuit of this ideal. Mahayanists may be perfectly correct in assuming that the Buddha intended this emphasis as an upaya, a skillful means of enabling one to realize concretely and vividly the absurd, vicious circle of desiring not to desire, or trying to get rid of selfishness by oneself. For this is certainly the conclusion to which the practice of the Buddha's doctrine led. It may be attributed to laziness and loss of nerve, but it seems more plausible to suggest that those who remained in the path of self-deliverance were merely unconscious of the paradox involved. For wherever the Mahayana continues to teach the way of liberation by one's own effort, it does so as an expedient for bringing the individual to a vivid awareness of his own futility. Various indications suggest that one of the earliest notions of the Mahayana was the conception of the Bodhisattva, not simply as a potential Buddha, but as one who, by renouncing nirvana, was at a higher spiritual level than one who attained it, and so withdrew from the world of birth and death. In the Pali Canon, the disciples of the Buddha who attain nirvana are termed arhans, or worthy ones, but in the Mahayana texts the ideal of the arhan is accounted almost selfish. It is fit only for the sravaka, the hearer of the doctrine, who has progressed only so far as to get a theoretical understanding. The Bodhisattva, however, is one who realizes that there is a profound contradiction in a nirvana attained by himself and for himself. From the popular standpoint, the Bodhisattva became a focus of devotion, bhakti, a savior of the world who had vowed not to enter the final nirvana until all other sentient beings had likewise attained it. For their sakes he consented to be born again and again into the round of samsara, until, in the course of innumerable ages, even the grass and the dust had attained Buddhahood. But from a deeper standpoint, it became obvious that the idea of the Bodhisattva is implicit in the logic of Buddhism, that it flows naturally from the principle of not grasping, and from the doctrine of the unreality of the ego. For if nirvana is the state in which the attempt to grasp reality has wholly ceased, through the realization of its impossibility, it will obviously be absurd to think of nirvana itself as something to be grasped or attained. If, furthermore, the ego is merely a convention, it is nonsense to think of nirvana as a state to be attained by some being. As is said in the Vajrachedika, all bodhisattva heroes should cultivate their minds to think. All sentient beings of whatever class are caused by me to attain the boundless liberation of nirvana. Yet when vast, innumerable, and immeasurable numbers of beings have thus been liberated, in truth no being has been liberated. Why is this, Subhuti? It is because no bodhisattva who is truly a bodhisattva holds to the idea of an ego, a personality, a being, or a separate individual. The The corollary of this position is that if there is no nirvana which can be attained, and if, in reality, there are no individual entities, it will follow that our bondage in the round is merely apparent, and that in fact we are already in nirvana, so that to seek nirvana is the folly of looking for what one has never lost. Naturally, then, the Bodhisattva makes no motion to depart from the round of samsara, as if nirvana were somewhere else, for to do so would imply that nirvana is something that needs to be attained, and that samsara is an actual reality. In the words of the Lankavatara Sutra, those who, afraid of the sufferings arising from the discrimination of birth and death, samsara, seek for nirvana, do not know that birth and death and nirvana are not to be separated from one another. And seeing that all things subject to discrimination have no reality, they imagine that nirvana consists in the future annihilation of the senses and their fields. To strive, then, to blot out the conventional world of things and events is to admit that it exists in reality. Hence the Mahayanist principle that what has never arisen does not have to be annihilated. These are not the idle speculations and sophistries of a system of subjective idealism or nihilism. They are answers to a practical problem, which may be expressed thus. If my grasping of life involves me in a vicious circle, how am I to learn not to grasp? How can I try to let go when trying is precisely not letting go? Stated in another way, to try not to grasp is the same thing as to grasp, since its motivation is the same, my urgent desire to save myself from a difficulty. I cannot get rid of this desire, since it is one and the same desire as the desire to get rid of it. This is the familiar, everyday problem of the psychological double bind, of creating the problem by trying to solve it, of worrying because one worries, and of being afraid of fear. Mahayana philosophy proposes a drastic but effective answer, which is the theme of a class of literature called Prajna Paramita, or Wisdom for Crossing to the Other Shore, a literature closely associated with the work of Nagarjuna, circa AD 200, who ranks with Shankara as one of the greatest minds of India. Stated baldly, the answer is that all grasping, even for nirvana, is futile, for there is nothing to be grasped. This is Nagarjuna's celebrated Sunyavada, his doctrine of the void, otherwise known as the Madhyamika, the middle way, because it refutes all metaphysical propositions by demonstrating their relativity. From the standpoint of academic philosophy, the Prajna Paramita and the doctrine of Nagarjuna are no doubt some form of nihilism or absolute relativism. But this is not Nagarjuna's standpoint. The dialectic with which he demolishes every conception of reality is merely a device for breaking the vicious circle of grasping, and the terminus of his philosophy is not the abject despair of nihilism, but the natural and uncontrived bliss, Ananda, of liberation. The Sunyavada takes its name from the term sunya, void, or sunyata, voidness, with which Nagarjuna described the nature of reality, or rather of the conceptions of reality which the human mind can form. Conceptions here include not only metaphysical views, but also ideals, religious beliefs, ultimate hopes, and ambitions of every kind. Everything which the mind of man seeks and grasps for his physical or spiritual security. Not only does the Sunyavada demolish the beliefs which one consciously adopts, it also seeks out the hidden and unconscious premises of thoughts and action, and submits them to the same treatment until the very depths of the mind are reduced to a total silence. Even the idea of sunya is itself to be voided. It cannot be called void or not void, or both or neither, but in order to point it out, it is called the void. Shtcherbatsky is certainly right in thinking that the Sunyavada is best called a doctrine of relativity, for Nagarjuna's method is simply to show that all things are without self-nature, svabhava, or independent reality, since they exist only in relation to other things. Nothing in the universe can stand by itself. No thing, no fact, no being, no event. and for this reason it is absurd to single anything out as the ideal to be grasped. For what is singled out exists only in relation to its own opposite, since what is defined by what is not. Pleasure is defined by pain, life is defined by death, and motion is defined by stillness. Obviously, the mind can form no idea of what to be means without the contrast of not to be, since the ideas of being and non-being are abstractions from such simple experiences as that there is a penny in the right hand and no penny in the left. From one point of view, the same relativity exists between Nirvana and Samsara, Bodhi, awakening, and Klesa, defilement. That is to say, the search for Nirvana implies the existence and the problem of Samsara, and the quest for awakening implies that one is in the state of defilement with delusion. To put it in another way, as soon as Nirvana is made an object of desire, it becomes an element of Samsara. The real Nirvana cannot be desired because it cannot be conceived. Thus the Lankavatara Sutra says, "Again, Mahatma, what is meant by non-duality? It means that light and shade, long and short, black and white, are relative terms, Mahatma, and not independent of each other. As Nirvana and Samsara are, all things are not too. There is no Nirvana except where is Samsara. There is no Samsara except where is Nirvana. For the condition of existence is not of a mutually exclusive character. Therefore it is said that all things are non-dual, as are Nirvana and Samsara." But the equation, Nirvana is Samsara, is true in another sense as well, namely that what appears to us to be Samsara is really Nirvana, and what appears to be the world of form, Rupa, is really the void, Sunya. Hence the famous saying, "Form is not different from emptiness. Emptiness is not different from form. Form is precisely emptiness. Emptiness is precisely form." Once again, this is not to say that awakening will cause the world of form to vanish without a trace, for Nirvana is not to be sought as the future annihilation of the senses and their fields. The sutra is saying that form is void, just as it is, in all its prickly uniqueness. The point of this equation is not to assert a metaphysical proposition, but to assist the process of awakening. For awakening will not come to pass when one is trying to escape or change the everyday world of form, or to get away from the particular experience in which one finds oneself at this moment. Every such attempt is a manifestation of grasping. Even the grasping itself is not to be changed by force, for Bodhi, awakening, is the 5 offenses, and the 5 offenses are Bodhi. If anyone regards Bodhi as something to be attained, to be cultivated by discipline, he is guilty of the pride of self. Some of these passages may suggest that the Bodhisattva may just as well be an easy-going, worldly fellow, who, because samsara is nirvana anyhow, can go on living just as he pleases. He may be thoroughly deluded, but since even delusion is Bodhi, there would be no point in trying to change it. There is often a deceptive resemblance between opposite extremes. Lunatics frequently resemble saints, and the unaffected modesty of the sage often lets him seem to be a very ordinary person. Yet there is no easy way of pointing out the difference, of saying what it is that the ordinary worldly fellow does or does not do, which makes him different from a bodhisattva, or vice versa. The entire mystery of Zen lies in this problem, and we shall return to it at the proper time. It is enough to say here that the so-called ordinary person is only apparently natural, or perhaps that his real naturalness feels unnatural to him. In practice, it is simply impossible to decide intentionally to stop seeking for nirvana and to live an ordinary life, for as soon as one's ordinary life is intentional, it is not natural. It is for this reason that the insistence of the Mahayana texts on the unattainability of nirvana and bodhi is not something to be accepted theoretically, as a mere philosophical opinion. One has to know, in one's bones, that there is nothing to be grasped. Thereupon the thought came to some of the gods in that assembly, "What the fairies talk and murmur, that we understand, though mumbled. What Subhuti has just told us, that we do not understand." Subhuti read their thoughts and said, "There is nothing to understand. There is nothing to understand. For nothing in particular has been indicated, nothing in particular has been explained. No one will grasp this perfection of wisdom as here explained, for no Dharma, doctrine, at all has been indicated, lit up, or communicated, so there will be no one who can grasp it." The point arrives, then, when it is clearly understood that all one's intentional acts, desires, ideals, stratagems, are in vain. In the whole universe, within and without, there is nothing whereon to lay any hold, and no one to lay any hold on anything. This has been discovered through clear awareness of everything that seemed to offer a solution, or to constitute a reliable reality, through the initiative wisdom called prajna, which sees into the relational character of everything. With the eye of prajna, the human situation is seen for what it is, a quenching of thirst with salt water, a pursuit of goals which simply require the pursuit of other goals, a clutching of objects which the swift course of time renders as insubstantial as mist. The very one who pursues, who sees and knows and desires the inner subject, has his existence only in relation to the ephemeral objects of his pursuit. He sees that his grasp upon the world is his stranglehold about his own neck, the hold which is depriving him of the very life he so longs to attain. And there is no way out, no way of letting go, which he can take by effort, by a decision of the will. But who is it that wants to get out? There comes a moment when this consciousness of the inescapable trap in which we are at once the trapper and the trapped reaches a breaking point. One might almost say that it matures, or ripens, and suddenly there is what the Lankavatara Sutra calls a turning about in the deepest seat of consciousness. In this moment, all sense of constraint drops away, and the cocoon which the silkworm spun around himself opens to let him go forth, winged as a moth. The peculiar anxiety which Kierkegaard has rightly seen to lie at the very roots of the ordinary man's soul is no longer there. Contrivances, ideals, ambitions, and self-propitiations are no longer necessary, since it is now possible to live spontaneously, without trying to be spontaneous. Indeed, there is no alternative, since it is now seen that there never was any self to bring the self under control. Reduced to the bare essentials, such is the inner process which the Sunyavada is trying to set in motion with its philosophy of total negation. Thus, the greater part of Nagarjuna's work was a carefully logical and systematic refutation of every philosophical position to be found in the India of his time. Granting that its object is an inner experience, Western students have always had difficulty in understanding how such a purely negative point of view could have any creative consequences. It must therefore be repeated that the negations apply not to reality itself, but to our ideas of reality. The positive and creative content of the Sunyavada is not in the philosophy itself, but in the new vision of reality which is revealed when its work is done, and Nagarjuna does not spoil this vision by trying to describe it. The Mahayana does, however, have another term for reality, which is perhaps rather more indicative than sunya, the void. This is the word tatata, which we may translate as suchness, thusness, or thatness. Similarly, the Buddhas are called tathagatas, those who go or come thus. The Sanskrit word tat, our that, is probably based on a child's first efforts at speech, when it points at something and says ta or da. Fathers flatter themselves by imagining that the child is calling them by name, dada or daddy. But perhaps the child is just expressing its recognition of the world, saying that. When we say just that or thus, we are pointing to the realm of nonverbal experience, to reality as we perceive it directly, For we are trying to indicate what we see or feel, rather than what we think or say. Tathata therefore indicates the world just as it is, unscreened and undivided by the symbols and definitions of thought. It points to the concrete and actual, as distinct from the abstract and conceptual. A Buddha is a Tathagata, a thus-goer, because he is awakened to this primary, non-conceptual world, which no words can convey, and does not confuse it with such ideas as being or non-being, good or bad, past or future, here or there, moving or still, permanent or impermanent. As the Bodhisattva Manjusri speaks of the Tathagata in the Saptasatika, suchness, Tathata, neither becomes nor ceases to become. Thus do I see the Tathagata. Suchness does not stand at any point or place. Thus do I see the Tathagata. Suchness is neither past, future, nor present. Thus do I see the Tathagata. Suchness does not arise from the dual or the non-dual. Thus do I see the Tathagata. Suchness is neither impure nor pure. Thus do I see the Tathagata. Suchness neither arises nor comes to an end. Thus do I see the Tathagata. Because Tathata is the true state of a Buddha, and of all things whatsoever, it is also referred to as our true or original nature, and thus our Buddha nature. One of the cardinal doctrines of the Mahayana is that all beings are endowed with Buddha nature, and so have the possibility of becoming Buddhas. Because of the identity of Buddha nature and Tathata, the term Buddha is frequently used of reality itself, and not just of the awakened man. It so comes about that in the Mahayana a Buddha is often seen as a personification of reality, forming the basis of those popular cults in which the Buddhas seem to be worshipped as gods. I say seem to be because even Mahayana Buddhism has no real equivalent of Judeo-Christian theism, with its strict identification of God with the moral principle. Furthermore, the various Buddhas who are so venerated, Amitabha, Vairocana, Amitayus, Ratnasambhava, etc., are always personifications of one's own true nature. Here, too, lies the basis of the Buddhism of faith, of the Sukhavati or Pure Land school, in which it is held that all efforts to become a Buddha are merely the false pride of the ego. All that is necessary is to repeat the formula Namo Amitabhaya, literally, the name of Amitabha, or Hail Amitabha, in the faith that this alone is sufficient to bring about one's rebirth in the Pure Land over which Amitabha presides. In this Pure Land, all the obstacles which stand in the way of becoming a Buddha in this world are removed, so that rebirth in the Pure Land is virtually equivalent to becoming a Buddha. The repetition of the name is held to be effective because, in ages past, Amitabha vowed that he would not enter into supreme Buddhahood unless rebirth in the Pure Land were assured for all beings who invoked his name. Because he subsequently entered the state of Buddhahood, the vow is effectively fulfilled. Even Nagarjuna was in sympathy with this doctrine, for it is obviously a popular and more graphic way of saying that since one's own true nature is already the Buddha nature, one does not have to do anything to make it so. On the contrary, to seek to become Buddha is to deny that one is already Buddha, and this is the sole basis upon which Buddhahood can be realized. In short, to become a Buddha, it is only necessary to have the faith that one is a Buddha already. Shinran, the great Japanese exponent of the Pure Land, went even so far as to say that it was only necessary to repeat the name, for he saw that the attempt to make an act of faith was too artificial, and led one to doubt one's own faith. Pure Land Buddhism is clearly an outgrowth of the Bodhisattva doctrine that the proper work of the liberated man is the liberation of all other beings by upaya, or skillful means. By prajna, or intuitive wisdom, he sees into the nature of reality, and this, in turn, awakens karuna, or compassion for all who are still in the bonds of ignorance. At its deepest level, karuna means something rather more than compassion for the ignorance of others. For we saw that the Bodhisattva's return into the world of samsara was based on the principle that samsara is in fact nirvana, and that the void is precisely form. If prajna is to see that form is void, karuna is to see that void is form. It is therefore an affirmation of the everyday world in its natural suchness, and this is one of the features of the Mahayana most strongly emphasized in Zen. Indeed, it makes nonsense of the idea that Buddhism is always a philosophy of world denial, in which the uniqueness of forms has no importance. It was because of karuna that Mahayana Buddhism became the principal inspiration of Chinese art in the Sung and Yuan dynasties, an art which stressed natural forms rather than religious symbols. For by karuna, it is seen that the dissolution of forms into the void is in no way different from the particular characteristics of the forms themselves. The life of things is only conventionally separable from their death. In reality, the dying is the living. The perception that each single form, just as it is the void, and that, further, the uniqueness of each form arises from the fact that it exists in relation to every other form, is the basis of the Dharma Dharma realm doctrine of the enormous Avatamsaka Sutra. This voluminous work is probably the final culmination of Indian Mahayana, and one of its central images is a vast network of gems or crystals, like a spider's web at dawn, in which each gem reflects all the others. This net of gems is the Dharma the universe, the realm of innumerable dharmas, or thing events. Chinese commentators worked out a fourfold classification of the Dharma which became of considerable importance for Zen late in the Tang dynasty. Their classification of the four Dharma realms was as follows. 1. Shi, the unique, individual thing events of which the universe is composed. 2. Li, the principle or ultimate reality underlying the multiplicity of things. 3. Li Shi Wuai, between principle and thing no obstruction, which is to say that there is no incompatibility between Nirvana and Samsara, void and form. The attainment of the one does not involve the annihilation of the other. 4. Shi Shi Wuai, between thing and thing no obstruction, which is to say that each thing event involves every other, and that the highest insight is simply the perception of them in their natural suchness. At this level, every thing event is seen to be self-determinative, self-generating, or spontaneous, for to be quite naturally what it is, to be tata just thus, is to be free and without obstruction. The doctrine of the Dharma is approximately that the proper harmony of the universe is realized when each thing event is allowed to be freely and spontaneously itself, without interference. Stated more subjectively, it is saying, let everything be free to be just as it is. Do not separate yourself from the world and try to order it around. There is a subtle distinction between this and mere laissez-faire, which may be suggested by the way in which we move our various limbs. Each one moves by itself, from within. To walk, we do not pick up our feet with our hands. The individual body is therefore a system of shi shi wu ai, and a Buddha realizes that the whole universe is his body, a marvelously interrelated harmony organized from within itself rather than by interference from outside. Mahayana philosophy thinks of the Buddha's body as threefold, as the Trikaya, or triple body. His body, considered either as the multitude of thing events or as his particular human forms, is termed the Nirvana Kaya, or body of transformation. The particular human forms are such historic and prehistoric Buddhas as Gautama, Kasyapa, or Kanakamuni, and since these appear in the flesh, the Nirvana Kaya includes, in principle, the entire universe of form. There is next the Samboka Kaya, or body of enjoyment. This is the sphere of prajna, wisdom, and karuna, compassion, the latter looking down to the world of form, and the former looking up to the realm of the void. Samboka Kaya might also be called the body of realization, since it is in this body that a Buddha realizes that he is a Buddha. Finally, there is the Dharmakaya, the Dharma body, which is the void, the sunya itself. Nagarjuna did not discuss the way in which the void appears as form, the Dharmakaya as the Nirvana, feeling, perhaps, that this would be completely unintelligible to those who had not actually realized awakening. For the Buddha himself had compared such inquiries to the foolishness of a man shot with an arrow, who would not permit it to be taken out of his flesh until he had been told all the details of his assailant's appearance, family, and motivations. Nevertheless, Nagarjuna's successors, the brothers Asanga and Vasubandhu, circa 280 to 360, who worked out the type of Mahayana philosophy generally known as Yogacara, made some attempt to discuss this particular problem. According to the Yogacara, the world of this form is Chitta Matra, mind only, or Vijnapti Matra, representation only. This view seems to have a very close resemblance to Western philosophies of subjective idealism, in which the external and material world is regarded as a projection of the mind. However, there seem to be some differences between the two points of view. Here, as always, the Mahayana is not so much a theoretical and speculative construction as an account of an inner experience and a means of awakening the experience in others. Furthermore, the word chitta is not precisely equivalent to our mind. Western thought tends to define mind by opposition to matter, and to consider matter not so much as measure, as the solid stuff which is measured. Measure itself, abstraction, is for the West more of the nature of mind, since we tend to think of mind and spirit as more abstract than concrete. But in Buddhist philosophy, chitta does not stand over against a conception of solid stuff. The world has never been considered in terms of a primary substance shaped into various forms by the action of mind or spirit. Such an image is not in the history of Buddhist thought, and thus the problem of how impalpable mind can influence solid matter has never arisen. Wherever we should speak of the material or physical or substantial world, Buddhism employs the term rupa, which is not so much our matter as form. There is no material substance underlying rupa unless it be chitta itself. The difficulty of making equations and comparisons between Eastern and Western ideas is that the two worlds do not start with the same assumptions and premises. They do not have the same basic categorizations of experience. When, therefore, the world has never been divided into mind and matter, but rather into mind and form, the word mind cannot mean quite the same thing in both instances. The word man, for example, does not have quite the same meaning when contrasted with woman as when contrasted with animal. A simplified and somewhat rough way of stating the difference is that Western idealists have begun to philosophize from a world consisting of mind, or spirit, form, and matter, whereas the Buddhists have begun to philosophize from a world of mind and form. The Yogacara does not, therefore, discuss the relation of forms to matter to mind. It discusses the relation of forms to mind, and concluded that they are forms of mind. As a result, the term mind, chitta, becomes logically meaningless. But because the main concern of Buddhism is with a realm of experience which is non-logical and meaningless, in the sense that it does not symbolize or signify anything other than itself, there is no objection to meaningless terms. From the logical standpoint, the proposition "everything is mind" says no more than that everything is everything. For if there is nothing which is not mind, the word belongs to no class, and has no limits, no definition. One might as well use blah, which is almost exactly what Buddhism does with the nonsense word tathata. For the function of these nonsense terms is to draw our attention to the fact that logic and meaning, with its inherent duality, is a property of thought and language, but not of the actual world. The nonverbal, concrete world contains no classes and no symbols which signify or mean anything other than themselves. Consequently, it contains no duality. For duality arises only when we classify, when we sort our experiences into mental boxes, since a box is no box without an inside and an outside. Mental boxes are probably formed in our minds long before formal thought and language supply labels to identify them. We have begun to classify as soon as we notice differences, regularities, and irregularities, as soon as we make associations of any kind. But, if the word mental means anything at all, this act of classification is certainly mental. For to notice differences, and to associate them with one another, is something more than simply than to respond to sense contacts. Yet if classes are a product of the mind, of noticing, association, thought, and language, the world, considered simply as all classes of objects, is a product of the mind. This is, I think, what the Yogacara means by the assertion that the world is mind only, chitta matram lokam. It means that external and internal, before and after, heavy and light, pleasant and painful, moving and still, are all ideas or mental classifications. Their relation to the concrete world is the same as that of words. Thus, the world that we know, when understood as the world as classified, is a product of the mind. And as the sound water is not actually water, the classified world is not the real world. The problem of what the mind is can now be seen to be the same as the problem of what the real world is. It cannot be answered, for every what is a class, and we cannot classify the classifier. Is it not, then, merely absurd to speak of the mind, the citta, at all, if there is no way of saying what it is? On the contrary, the mathematician Kurt Gödel has given us a rigorous proof of the fact that every logical system must contain a premise which it cannot define without contradicting itself. The Yogacara takes citta as its premise, and does not define it, since citta is here the equivalent of sunya and tathata. For the mind is beyond all philosophical views, is apart from discrimination. It is not attainable, nor is it ever born. I say there is nothing but mind. It is not an existence, nor is it a non-existence. It is indeed beyond both existence and non-existence. Out of mind spring innumerable things, conditioned by discrimination, that is, classification, and habit energy. These things people accept as an external world. What appears to be external does not exist in reality. It is indeed mind that is seen as multiplicity, the body, property, and abode. All these, I say, are nothing but mind. Within this undefined continuum of citta, the Yogacara describes 8 kinds of vijnana, or discriminating consciousness. There is a consciousness appropriate to each of the 5 senses. There is the 6th sense consciousness, mano-vijnana, unifying the other 5 so that what is touched or heard may be related to what is seen. There is manas, center of the mind's discriminative and classifying activity. And finally, there is the store consciousness, alaya vijnana, the supra-individual mind which contains the seeds of all possible forms. The store consciousness is almost equivalent to the citta itself, and is supra-individual because it stands prior to every differentiation. It is not to be conceived as a sort of ghostly gas permeating all beings, since space and extension are likewise here only in potentiality. In other words, the store consciousness is that from which the formal world arises spontaneously or playfully, vikridita. For the Mahayana does not make the mistake of trying to account for the production of the world from the mind by a series of necessary causes. Whatever is linked by causal necessity is of the world of Maya, not beyond it. Speaking somewhat poetically, the world illusion comes out of the great void for no reason, purposelessly, and just because there is no necessity for it to do so. For the activity of the void is playful or vikridita, because it is not motivated action, karma. Thus, as the Yogacara describes it, the production of the formal world arises spontaneously from the store consciousness, flows up into the manas, where the primordial differentiations are made, passes thence into the 6 sense consciousnesses, which in turn produce the sense organs or gates, ayatana, through which it finally projects the classified external world. The Buddhist yoga, therefore, consists in reversing the process, instilling the discriminative activity of the mind, and letting the categories of Maya fall back into potentiality, so that the world may be seen in its unclassified suchness. Here, karuna awakens, and the Bodhisattva lets the projection arise again, having become consciously identified with the playful and purposeless character of the void.